Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 18 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Vancouver Canucks, in which the Sharks have lost 3-1. So the good news here is, compared to the Sharks' first matchup with the Canucks this season, they saw a massive improvement in terms of performance. The bad news is that since that first matchup was a 10-1 loss, it didn't actually take all that much for the Sharks to look better here tonight than in that previous game. And so while their level of play may have rose from here to here, the fact is that the Canucks were all the way up here still. And so while it's not a 9-goal deficit 10-1 embarrassing loss, it is still a loss in the standings, 0 points gained, 3-1, very basic type of loss to this strong Pacific Division contender. And this one starts off in the first period much better than in the previous game, as the Sharks did not find themselves in a 4-goal deficit, instead tied at 0 after 20 minutes. And while this was not a well-played period by the San Jose Sharks in terms of generating chances for themselves, they didn't give the Canucks a lot to work with. Blackwood made a couple of good saves, and in general, it's a first period where on the road the Sharks emerge not trailing by any goals, and so while they don't score themselves, it can be deemed a relative success. The second period then rolls around and the Sharks find themselves in the early hole, which is obviously not good. I've mentioned multiple times that the Sharks have yet to win a game this season in which they haven't scored first, and so with Quinn Hughes making it 1-0 Vancouver, the Sharks were immediately on the back foot. However, they had a golden opportunity served to them in the late second period, as it is Hoglander who takes a major penalty against Kevin Labanc, giving the Sharks a 5-minute power play. Now, reminder, a 5-minute power play is different from the usual 2-minute power play, which is that you can actually score as many goals as you possibly can over that 5-minute man advantage. Just off the top of my head, a completely random number, you could score something like 4 goals to take the lead in a Game 7 in the playoffs, or something along those lines. So the Sharks had an opportunity here to not only tie this game, but get the lead for themselves and perhaps even pad that lead here in this one. But at the very least, you're expecting a goal, maybe a couple of goals. But instead, the Sharks power play at the end of the second period at least do exactly what they've done the entire season thus far, which is pretty much nothing. And even worse than nothing, they're giving up offensive chances against. And it is Lafferty who manages to get a shorthanded goal in the last second, literally the last second of the second period, where the Sharks just essentially stopped skating and felt as though the period was over, and a 1-0 very manageable deficit turned into a 2-0 much more difficult deficit, considering the Sharks, even though they managed to put up 5 goals in the previous game against the St. Louis Blues, have still struggled to score goals the entirety of this season. In the third period, they would manage to get a power play goal for themselves on this 5-minute major. That would be the Tomas Hertl goal, but generally the power play still struggled. They can't enter the zone in any sort of efficient manner. Honestly, this is their biggest issue on the power play, entering the zone, something that should absolutely be practiced if you are David Quinn. But even setting up in the zone, it doesn't feel as though they're due for any sort of goals, where they're getting so many great chances that it's only a matter of time before one actually goes in. Even if we take a look at this Tomas Hertl goal, this is a Mikael Granlund pass from behind the goal line that doesn't reach the, I would imagine, intended targets in front of either Zetterlund or Hertl. Instead goes through 6 sticks to get to Kalen Addison at the point, who then takes a shot. It gets blocked by Myers, happens to drop right in front of Hertl, who's able to take a sort of knuckle ball type of shot and beats Demko here. This doesn't feel as though the hard work was put in and it's an amazing power play type of goal, more so that the Sharks ended up getting a bounce in this one to make it to get themselves on the board. It's not the end of the world that something like that happens. You'll take the bounces where you can get them, but it just feels as though there needs to be more of a consistent level on the Sharks power play. And 18 games into the season, we have basically never actually seen that. The Sharks would have the game within 1, but unfortunately the third period would likely be their worst one of the game. They gave up a lot of good chances to the Canucks. They managed to expand on the lead to make it 3-1 Vancouver, and even though the Sharks would pull the goaltender and get some decent zone time there, it would be Mike Hoffman who'd end up taking a penalty, and that would pretty much put the game away, and so indeed a 3-1 loss to the Canucks. Moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line, and I'm actually going to start off with William Eklund. Eklund, he did technically score a goal in this game. This was off of a very nice play that he himself made, then a drive to the net by Fabian Zetterlund. Eklund taps it in, but unfortunately, it gets challenged by the Canucks coaching staff and called back for the goaltender interference, as they say that Zetterlund interfered with Demko, which I wasn't necessarily in agreement with, but I didn't necessarily see much of a problem for it to get called back either. Just an unfortunate situation for Eklund, who had multiple great chances, not only in this game, but has in the past throughout this entirety of this season. The Sharks have struggled to score goals, and Eklund has been doing his best to try and just contribute here or there by getting a goal, perhaps getting an assist, setting up some great chances, and they just haven't been going in. So while he is racking up a decent amount of points, at least relative to his teammates, he definitely could have more with just a bit more bounces or a bit more help generally. And this was just a solid game for William Eklund, one of their best, if not their best forwards on the night. And what was interesting is that in the third period, David Quinn ends up dropping him down to the second line. Now, I refuse to believe that this is for any performance-related reasons in a negative sense, that this is a demotion viewed. My idea, and this is the only way I can actually cope with this type of coaching decision, my idea is that Eklund was dropped to the second line with Granlund and Duclair as a way to spark those two players who were doing very little in the earlier parts of this game. So put your best performing forward with your two worst performing forwards, and maybe that would be a way to sort of revive them and get them to actually do something in this game. I don't know if that logic is particularly sound. I don't know if that's a good idea, but like I said, it is the only way I can actually cope with such a move being made, because Eklund was looking so good in this game, so to actually justify demoting him is quite tough. When it comes to the two other players here, I actually really liked Zetterlund. It felt as though he showed off some strong stick handling in tonight's game, and while his defensive game, I will say, left a lot to be desired, it felt as though his positioning in the defensive zone was quite off here tonight. His offensive game was at the very least pretty good, and so I would say it was a generally positive game for Zetterlund and for the rest of the first line. Hertl felt as though he was almost this weak link, at least at even strength. Obviously, he does score the goal on the power play, which was nice to see, but he didn't exactly dominate the ice. He didn't exactly show off his high-level skill set either, and so while Eklund was doing a lot of good things here, Zetterlund was making some nice moves, Hertl kind of lagging behind a bit. Still pretty decent, but not great. When it comes to this second line, though, we have Zadina joining Granlund and Duclair. This is because Gushin was sent back down to the Barracuda, a decision that I didn't necessarily agree with, but here we are. Zadina bumped up from the third to the second line, and it does pretty much nothing through the majority of this game. Duclair just is quite invisible. He had a couple of good chances right near the end of the game. In the last few minutes, he got two good looks, but is otherwise just not really doing anything on the ice. This is the exact same situation as it was in the previous game against the St. Louis Blues, and it just doesn't feel as though he's fully healthy and fully back to form as he was when he was taken out of the lineup due to his illness. The same will be said by Granlund, though not with the same type of excuse given for him. Granlund, just at even strength, is not generating anything at all in terms of offensive chances, and so the second line, where you're expected some level of offense from it, even though the Sharks are heavily injured at this point, it's just not nearly good enough. And then when it comes to Zadina, he does end up getting the benefit of the Eklund swap as he jumps up to the first line and actually looks quite good in the few shifts he did take with Hertl and Zetterlund. If there is anything that we have learned here through the first 18 games of this season about Zadina, is that he is not a play driver at all. When he has the puck, he can make some nice things happen, but he's not particularly good at actually getting the puck for himself and, sort of setting up his teammates in that regard. And so he's much better suited when he's playing off of a couple of other players, and that's exactly what he does in this first line with Hertl and Zetterlund. So he has a couple of good offensive zone shifts, but the fact is that you're not going to be a super successful player in the NHL if you can't really do much for yourself. So I'm not exactly sure what the long-term solution is for Zadina. When it comes to the third line, we did have a substitution, not for play reason, but instead Nico Sturm steps out of the lineup due to personal reasons. We'll see eventually if he returns within the next couple of days or the next couple of weeks. We do not know exactly what's going on, but for at the moment, it is Luke Cunnin who steps in at the center position. He takes third line center with LeBanc, who steps back into the lineup, as well as Mike Hoffman. Now, Hoffman had been playing well in these past couple of games. Cunnin as well had a very strong one against the St. Louis Blues, and so they're joined by LeBanc, who hadn't played in a while. So this was a recipe to have a good third line. While I don't think this third line was a liability, and I did think they were okay, they didn't exactly generate anything, and so I was not exactly expecting big things, but I was hoping for some chances. And besides Hoffman getting like one good look with the goaltender pulled right at the end of the game, and Cunnin making a couple of decent defensive plays, this third line just didn't do much, which was somewhat disappointing for sure. And then we have the fourth line. So with Gushin being sent down and Sturm stepping out of the lineup, we had LeBanc fill in one of those spots. The other one being Jacob McDonald. Even though he is not technically a forward, he has been playing more so forward for the San Jose Sharks as of late than defenseman. And, I don't even have that much of an issue with it. I wouldn't even call this an 11 forward, 7 defenseman setup, because McDonald is much better suited for a forward role than a defensive role. He actually looks pretty good in this game. I was disappointing to see him play over Gushin, and I'm still kind of disappointed, but at the very least McDonald has done a pretty good job in his fourth line role, not just this game, but just generally every single time he's been put into the lineup. So that's a nice thing to see. Carpenter, he had some good chances, but it felt as though he was almost slightly off in this game. A lot of puck bobbles, a bit awkward to watch, not bad, but just a bit strange, I would say. And Giovanni Smith got a couple of good chances for himself. Not much else to say. It was a generally positive game for the fourth line and for Smith himself. When it comes to the defensive side of things, we have the top pairing of Ferraro and Emberson, who I thought were tasked with having a very, very, very tough job here tonight. The Canucks are not only one of the better teams in the NHL this season, but have some of the best players in terms of point production thus far this year, with Quinn Hughes, Elias Pettersson, JT Miller. So they certainly had their hands full, and these were the two players playing primarily against that top competition. And I thought Ferraro and Emberson did an admirable job. Were there opportunities for those Canucks players? Absolutely. You're never going to be able to fully shut them down, but they did a very strong job at limiting the amount of opportunities that they could get in this game, so I will commend them for that for sure. When it comes to this second pairing, we have Ruta and Addison. I was somewhat critical of Addison in the previous game against the St. Louis Blues, where I mentioned I didn't really notice him. Here tonight, I felt as though he was a bit more noticeable. He actually jumped up in the rush a couple of times, which is definitely something that I want to see from him more. And his defensive game was better than average, I would say. So a positive performance for Addison on the night for sure. And then when it comes to Ruta, I didn't really notice Ruta, but unlike for Addison, who that's kind of a negative considering the offensive output that he's supposed to have, for Ruta, there isn't really that expectation of offense. And so him having a non-noticeable night is actually a pretty good thing. And then when it comes to the third pairing, we see Okhotyuk and Burrows. So it should be noted the Sharks had 0 changes on defense here tonight, which means Vlasic, once again, the healthy scratch, something that I am in full favor of for sure. However, when it comes to this third defensive pairing, Okhotyuk and Burrows, I thought they started the game decently well, but it felt as though as time went on, they just continuously had some pretty bad shifts. Okhotyuk especially has just been struggling as of late, which is kind of now in my mind that Vlasic may be someone who could step in for Okhotyuk at this point if David Quinn decides to pull the trigger in that part. While he is a nice little complementary piece to the Sharks defensive core by being a bigger bodied player who's willing to sort of throw his weight around, he just hasn't really been up to par in these last few games. With the giveaways weren't the issue here tonight. It was more so the defensive awareness, but it was just not really good enough. And Burrows, as a defenseman, seems to be the type of guy who really plays off of his defensive partner. When his defensive partner is playing well, Burrows is able to sort of just shut things down well on top of that. But when his defensive partner is not playing well, Burrows just follows right behind, and it's just not great because mostly he's not exactly a fantastic puck-moving defenseman. Burrows is. He occasionally is able to make a strong first pass out of the zone, but more often than not, he's mostly looking for his partner to do exactly that, and when the other partner is not playing well, that's exactly what ends up happening. When it comes to the goaltender here tonight, we had Blackwood starting, and not a major surprise as the Sharks are willing to go back to Blackwood with how strong he has been thus far this season. But after a very good performance by Kähkönen against the Blues, it was a question of whether or not Kähkönen would get that second straight start. But perhaps because Kähkönen was the one who started that first game against the Canucks and let in 6 goals en route to that 10-1 loss, they didn't want to have him start that again in case of like some PTSD or something. So Blackwood gets the opportunity and plays rather well, I would say. Didn't have much of a chance on the Lafferty goal. Didn't have much of a chance on the Miller one. The Hughes one is one that I do think he overcommits a bit in trying to shut down the angle along the post, which gives Quinn a lot of room to work with on the left side of the net. So I think Blackwood could have had better positioning on that one, but he made a lot of very good saves in this game, and I can't blame him when the Sharks are only managing to score a single goal. So generally a decent game. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Wednesday, where they will take on the Seattle Kraken after a strong second season for the Kraken, their first time making the playoffs. They kind of have fallen back down to earth slightly thus far this season. We'll see if the Sharks manage to get the win. We'll see which goaltender ends up actually starting as well in that game, and we'll see how sort of the injuries as well as the players sitting out end up falling into place. Class dismissed.